2018 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland is underway. This year, with the absence of President Xi Jinping and his defense of globalization against U.S. President Donald Trump's beliefs in 2017, the ideas of inequality, environmental threats, and safeguarding data have all been at the forefront of discussion in Davos. However, the theme is a shared future, something proposed by President Xi Jinping last year, and seemingly something that has resonated strongly. And with that idea of a shared future, India has stepped into the spotlight. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi presented the Indian version of their dream to an attentive audience. What can we expect from Davos for 2018? Is the Indian dream something we can all share in, or should we pay more attention to the agenda of European leaders or the possible quarrels between and among allies of the United States here in Davos? We have many other influential topics being discussed by the global community and concerning our shared future. To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Ke Wen, a Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Adam Dunat, who is the Secretary General of the European Chamber in China and Vice Chairman of the European Business Organization Worldwide Network. We shall also speak by satellite to Robert Cab, the Director of the Economist Network. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we start the discussion, let's look at this.
It is my great honor.
Welcomed by Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of World Economic Forum, Liu He, a high-ranking Chinese official in economic affairs, shared his perspective on China's future economic development.
At such a stage of development, China needs to put more emphasis on structural improvement rather than quantity expansion.
Liu says China's main tasks include preventing and resolving risks, conduct targeted poverty reduction, and control pollution.
Green and low-carbon development is what the Chinese people and people across the world want the most.
Liu says China will continue to advance reform and opening up, as well as encourage global competition.
We will further integrate with international trade rules and ease market access. We will also substantially open up the services sector, the financial sector in particular, and create a more attractive investment environment.
Last year in Davos, Chinese President Xi Jinping positioned himself as firmly in favor of globalization, and the same message was delivered this year.
Over the past year, in line with the propositions of President Xi, China has stood firm against all forms of protectionism.
In his remarks, Schwab says China's future is intrinsically linked to the fate of the global economy, marked ever increasingly by protectionism and the looming threat of trade wars. But China is willing to connect and cooperate the world to solve global issues together. Wang Yuan, CGTN.
Welcome to our discussion here about the Winter Davos. What are the issues that you think may have captured attention of the media in Davos?
I think it is very interesting that the theme of this year's Davos annual meeting is shared future for mankind, which is similar as to what proposed by President Xi Jinping 1 year ago at Davos. That's a community of shared destiny for mankind. The purpose of this year's Davos annual meeting is to discuss how to bring the development of the world to a sustainable path. That is, over the past 10 years since the global financial crisis, we have seen a sound recovery of the world economy. Still, it's not complete because that's the winner of the capital, but there are still large areas of poverty and disadvantagement for labor. So we are still in a separated world. The important thing is shared future. We should grow together. I think this is the central topic.
Well, world leaders may be in the same boat, but may not necessarily be on the same page. Congratulations on the steady, yet somehow slow economic recovery of the European Union, despite the impact of Brexit. So what do you think of the agenda for European leaders in Davos? Do you think they will try to narrow down the differences between the two sides across the Atlantic Ocean. I've noticed what Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, said one day ahead of the arrival of Donald Trump, that Europeans and the rest of the world should not shut off from the rest of the world. Globalization instead of protectionism should be the theme that we address together in close partnership. Do you think this is a prelude to a quarrel and debate between leaders on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean?
I don't think it's a prelude to debate. I think it's an ongoing one that we're having. I think Europe has benefited immensely from openness. Europe is now the world's single largest market, and it's been at peace for nearly 75 years now because of it. So I think a lot of the people that are there, a lot of the leaders and countries recognize the benefits that globalization has brung, but it hasn't brought it for everyone. But I think the answer is to fix the issues where there are problems, but not to throw, as they say, the baby out with the bathwater, because it has brought a lot of prosperity and has brought a lot of people out of poverty. So it's about tweaking it, it's not about stopping it.
Robert, what do you think of the issue of globalization, or the other way around, for world leaders, and particularly agenda of the media?
Wow, that's a very broad question. So, I mean, globalization is, as your questions and the responses there were indicating, Young Ray, still a very hot topic. I mean, Davos is kind of the ultimate conference that discusses globalization. I guess what's interesting is to see how the tide has turned, or the tables have turned. Is maybe both are accurate, but it's kind of a table turning situation where you see someone like the leaders of, or people like the leaders of China now advocating globalization, where China really only entered the global trading system some 30 years ago. And the U.S., which used to be most associated with post-World War II globalization, has now really retreated. It'll be interesting to see what President Trump says, but you definitely see a shift in that regard. So globalization is still a hot topic, but we see different players involved in championing globalization now. And like Adam was just mentioning, even within Europe, there is, of course, a strong division. We have Brexit. We have the rise of the far right in various continental European countries. So even with very progressive leaders like Angela Merkel and Macron in France, who are looking towards more globalization, they are contending with opposite parties that are trying to bring their countries into a more nationalistic frame of mind.
Is Davos an occasion for politics or economics, Robert? Very quickly.
Well, very basically, I would say it's both. Maybe you could say it's the politics that are driving economics, is the way discussions seem to take place at Davos. I'd say there's a slight skew towards politics.
This is an issue for the media because China was accused of stealing the spotlight last year, with President Xi Jinping calling for globalization and free trade during the absence of President Donald Trump and maybe Obama. This time around, Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, put forward the Indian version of their dream, and therefore some of my colleagues on the team are happy about the Indian dream, as if it's a zero-sum game. What do you think?
I think it would be a good thing if India can grow very fast. If we can double its GDP in 5 years to $5 trillion US. That would be the contribution to the whole world growth. However, we have to wait and see clearly whether India can really reach that goal, because there are many difficulties in its own economy, and how they can sustain the growth, remains to be seen.
But never underestimate the vision, the sense of pride after the notion of Indo-Pacific was put forward by American policymakers. And therefore, India may have good reasons to feel that it can take advantage of all sides of the game, because India is the game changer, perhaps, in this new strategy of the Indo-Pacific. So what do you think of the position of the Indian government in this process of globalization? It could go west, it could somehow, raise the bargaining chips.
I think everybody needs to look where the opportunities are and to seize those opportunities. So there's been good efforts on TPP, we tried TTIP, we've got WTO, we've got RCEP. India is in a very interesting situation. It's got a higher percentage of growth rate. China's much more higher GDP in absolute terms, but in terms of the forecast, it looks very, very good for India. But it's also got its challenges. Infrastructure there remains underdeveloped. They've got high unemployment. And for foreign companies that I know that are doing business there, it has been tough because of some of the regressive tax policies, retroactive tax policies that they've implemented. So I think India's got a great opportunity ahead of itself, but it's got many, many challenges. And whoever is willing to work with India and benefit from opportunities in a win-win situation could be good for India and those countries.
Robert, what do you think would be the agenda of President Donald Trump? Because his absence of last year generated more uncertainty and unpredictability about his advocacy for either the issue of globalization or the idea of putting America first.
Well, he seems definitely determined to make a lot of statements regarding making America first. We've already seen that with Steve Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross, who have arrived in Davos and been making statements. So it seems pretty unmistakable that the U.S. is going to be talking about its self-interest more than global interest. And by that basis, you could argue it's maybe better if Trump continued to stay away from an event like Davos. I think actually his presence this year isn't really for the global community, it's for his base in the United States, so he can show he's standing up for the reasons he was elected.
This year, President Xi Jinping didn't go there, but he sent his special envoy, Mr. Liu He, member of the Politburo and the chief economist of this new generation of the Chinese Communist leadership. He gave a keynote presentation at the invitation of Schwab, founding chairman of the Winter Davos. So what do you think of the major points that Mr. Liu He presented?
I think Mr. Liu He mostly gives the picture of China's economic policy in the country. That is, the general goal is to change from growth by speed to growth for quality. That is, the central line is supply side reform. And the three major tasks. One is to stabilize the financial system, to forestall any systemic risks, especially to bring down the leverage. That's first. And second, alleviation poverty, to kill all the strict poverty by the year 2020. The third one is to do a good job in environmental control. I think he gives a very clear picture to the world what China is doing.
You are watching Dialogue with Weiwen and Adam. We are talking to Robert Cab on satellite crossover. Stay with us. We'll be right back and continue to discuss issues in Winter Davos. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, gentlemen. Yes, China was the focus of the media last year in Winter Davos. This time around, President Xi Jinping sent Liu He, his chief economist, there, emphasizing the same message of sustainable support for globalization. However, we are treating accusations with the United States about the issue of trade protectionism. And they complain that they have been denied access to the Chinese market in some areas. What do you think of their complaints?
Well, let's be frank. In China, it's the response when we ask about market access issues is that China is still a developing country, and many areas of the economy are now open. It will continue to open. It's not going to go back. But there are certain sectors that still remain closed or restricted, such as the auto sector, such as shipbuilding, airplane manufacturing. Those are the key areas, and those are the areas, quite frankly, that I think those and in the service sector that sometimes give rise to tensions, particularly as China, as it invests more and more overseas, gets access to the same sectors and markets in Europe and the United States, and European and American companies can't get that same access yet here as of today. So I think there's, the term reciprocity frequently comes up. And what we're looking for is increased reciprocity.
Let me go to Robert. In the 1980s, the Japanese government didn't give Americans equal access to the market shares for luxurious brands of the automobiles. And I don't know whether that has led to the Plaza Accord and stagnation of the Japanese economy, as well as drastic appreciation of Japanese yen. What do you think of, say, protectionism back in the 1980s, and do you think China is practicing much the same to protect our own homegrown industries, such as automobile and the service industry?
Well, it's another one of those interesting, very involved questions there, Young Ray. I would say there are very similar parallels to what we saw with Japan and Japan-U.S. relations in the case of China today. It's just as you heard Adam responding to there, it's not just China versus one country like the U.S., it's also versus the EU and other trading partners, that they are seeing a restricted access, and that does have a lot of echoes of what we saw in the 1980s. In terms of the Plaza Accord, of course, that was a devaluation of the yen, the Japanese yen, to try to rectify the trade imbalance, and that created a lot of damage. But I would say the long-term damage and the stagnation we saw in Japan, while you could say the Plaza Accord was a triggering event, it certainly wasn't the root cause. And Japan's own closed economy brought about the continued stagnation. So I think the positive part here to the historic parallels is that China can learn from what Japan did. It is opening up more. I would say it's not as closed as Japan was, and hopefully it will continue to open up. Liu He said we're going to be pleasantly surprised by what we'll see, so hopefully that will prove to be the case. And if China can manage to open up more, it will be better for China as well as the rest of the world.
What do you think of the Chinese demand that market shares here in China should be traded for high-tech products from the United States, and yet the United States says no, citing national security as the reason? In this case, what do you think of the huge trade deficit in favor of China?
Oh, yes, because President Donald Trump complains constantly the huge trade imbalance between the States and China. There are many reasons. I think the basic reason is not the restriction of U.S. high-tech exports to China. That's one of the reasons, because that factor alone cannot change the whole picture, because this is based on the global supply chain because of the division work of United States and China in different positions in the global supply chain. However, the control of U.S. export, high-tech exports to China did contribute to trade deficits on the U.S. side. We have been working hard for this purpose for many years. Still, little progress has been made. So this has led our thinking that this is not a trade issue. It's a political and strategic issue.
Our exports of solar panels and special steel have both been denied by the United States and the European Union in different cases. The thing is that China has seriously honored its promise to, or commitment to, climate change. So our production of solar panels in the green energy industry is, of course, something that has impressed the world. At the same time, exports of solar panels are facing anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigation from the United States. What do you think of the structural contradiction here? Adam?
Well, we went through a similar issue in Europe as well a couple of years ago. We did come to a solution at the end of the day, so solutions can be found. This investment has actually been, on the one hand, very good for the world, for clean energy. The prices have been brought down, so consumers have done very well from it. But Europe was a key leader in solar industry in the past, and its industry got very badly hurt by what we feel was the unfair subsidized industry here in China. And that led to a fair amount of overcapacity, which left Europe in the solar industry badly hurt by it. So I think, investment in renewables is great. Low prices is good for consumers, but the question is it sustainable for industry as a whole? And what we don't want to do is end up destroying industries on unsustainable terms.
Robert, what do you think of the embarrassment regarding China's exports of solar panels? Do you think this practice of trade protectionism will do the environment any good?
Well, it's an interesting point, Yang. Certainly, having an abundance of solar panels, making solar panels cheap, is good for consumers. It is good for the spread of renewable energy sources. So that is a net positive in a social sense. Economically, though, we can get into a lot of discussion on if you do have state support of the solar industry like you've seen in China, is that fair in countries where there hasn't been? I will point out there has been state support, of course, in the EU and the US. Where I'm from in the United States, California, there's been a lot of state support, but it hasn't been on the manufacturing side, it's been on the installation side and the operation side. So the source of contention was that Chinese manufacturers had an unfair advantage from the perspective of US and European manufacturers. But to your point, indeed, it's great to have cheap solar energy, and I hope we have more of it, ideally through efficient markets and fair trade.
Let's look at what Lagarde of IMF said. She said that the more world leaders are concerned about excessive inequality, billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio has been warning of a big squeeze on the middle class approaches as blue-collar jobs evaporate. You are from Canada. What do you think of your Prime Minister's concerns? The growing income gap and polarization of the classes.
I mean, truth be told, there is a growing divergence between the rich and the poor. It's been happening for the last, at least last 30 years, and it's a problem. It's a real problem we need to look at, because at the end of the day, globalization, the free trade and investment systems that we have are founded and supported by individuals, by a populace at the end of the day. And if a large portion of that populace feels that they're not benefiting from this system, they might not be willing to support it anymore. We've seen, on the other hand, Canada and the EU, in terms of the discrepancy between the rich and the poor, in terms of inequality, both are some of the most inclusive countries and economies we have in the world. In fact, the change there has been minimal compared to other developing countries and developed countries around the world. But this is an issue I think we need to tackle together, and I think there's certain initiatives that are taking place from a global perspective that can be helpful. Looking at global tax, for example, Basel III is a good way to make sure that companies pay the taxes that they should be paying in the countries where they're domiciled or to which they owe those taxes. And the discussions that we're having, I think, that have been taking place at Davos, also around inclusiveness and equality, need to continue.
Tax cuts or tax increases have always been a favorite policy tool employed by world leaders. Look at the tax cuts that was narrowly approved by lawmakers in the DC, and recently the Chinese authorities made it no secret that we're going to introduce a bill at the upcoming legislative plenary session in March to impose property tax. And when we look at the issue of income discrepancies, do you think when 80% of the newly created wealth went to 1% of the world's population, we're going to close the income gap through a legislative piece about income reform and about tax reform?
Yes, tax reform is effective, but still tax reform alone cannot do the whole thing. We have to have additional social policies. The disparity created was made mostly from the different natures of earning by capital and that earning by labor. There's a big gap. Earning by capital will be growing very fast, much faster than earning by labor. So that's a law, economic law. The important thing is what the government should do. The government should adjust that to have heavy tax on the rich people to subsidize the poor, and also to provide the public goods education, job training, and healthcare and housing, so on and so forth, so as to bring down the disparity. I think the number one responsibility is the government.
We have no idea about the income discrepancy the world over. However, we notice that domestic spending contributed 58.8% of China's economic growth of last year, and the service industry 60%. Now, when so many consumers in China complain about the poor income redistribution, how could we enjoy such a robust domestic consumption? Robert, what are your thoughts?
Well, China is in a very unique situation where it's a large economy. It has an economy that's developed in some areas, like we see along the coastal regions and the cities in particular, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, for example. And then it has more poverty in rural areas in the hinterlands. So in terms of what's going on with consumption, you see a consumption engine in the developed parts of the economy. You don't see that it's much in these rural poor areas, and that is why you have the income disparity. I think what's positive with this is China's momentum is towards more services, more consumption. We need to see carefully guided growth towards the hinter regions, so it's not just based on, say, property, which has been what we've seen in a lot of second and third tier cities. There needs to be real manufacturing investment, real useful infrastructure investments such as schools and so forth. That will go further to addressing long-term poverty. But the consumption dynamic is definitely part of what we see in developed China, and it's quite impressive. It's now leading the world in terms of growth.
One of the three pillar tasks that Mr. Liu He listed in his keynote presentation in Davos is poverty alleviation. President Xi Jinping said in his opening remarks at the 19th National Congress, not a single should be left behind in the poverty reduction campaign by the year 2020. Another 10 million would be lifted out of poverty. So do you think for developing countries this is the overriding concern, and do you think China deserves the credit for that? What is the immediate second economy that has done much the same job?
I don't think anybody's done the job that China's done, and it's 10 million a year over the next 3 years. I think it's very likely going to hit this target, and at the end of the day, China being the socialist economy that it is, and country that it is, has to be paramount. And for the system to continue to work as it has and does, this is a critical component of the economy that needs to be taken care of.
What is the driving force behind the unprecedented success of China's poverty alleviation campaign? Political will or the general national strength of the economy? What is it?
I think there's two key elements. First, the centralized leadership and the decision by the top leadership to alleviate the poverty, to have all the people enjoy a better life. So that is the key factor. And the second is we have a large economy. We have enough resources nationwide to mobilize the resources from rich provinces to support the poor provinces. So we have that ability.
Well, no one should question the political will of President Xi Jinping and determination of the team to maximize the policy execution in reducing poverty. With that, we come to the end of this edition about Davos and the major issues on the agenda there for world leaders. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.